So as I see more and more colleagues joining, I can see that we have good representation already from both sectors here, so both areas here. So I hope more and more are going to be joining. Thank you so much. And by the end of the session, we hope that you will be first familiar with the 16 minimum standards for GBV emergencies programming, that you are aware of the supporting tools and how to use them, and also that you have information about the challenges as well as some promising practices of implementing these standards from a range of complex humanitarian situations. So good luck to us on meeting these objectives. So let's turn over to you, colleagues, and hear a bit more from you about the GBV emergencies minimum standards. So if you can move to the next slide, colleagues. So with this, I would like to invite you to this very short Mentimeter poll. You can use this QR code here on the slide or go to the link www.menti.com and enter the code 4460102, as you can see here. Let's see if colleagues have any concerns about this. If you have, do let us know. Are we able to join?
Would you be able to pop the Mentimeter into the chat so we could click through? Thanks.
That's a great suggestion. I think you can see that there's a link already in the chat. Thank you, Jeffrey. So I hope colleagues have been able to join the Menti, and let's go over and see if you have been able to access the first question. The first question is very simple, really. Have you heard of this minimum standards prior to this event? Okay, we see more and more colleagues are joining the Menti, so let's give ourselves a few minutes, a few seconds rather, to let's see how many colleagues are familiar with this tool already. And while we're doing so, thank you so much for everybody who's taken the chat room floor to introduce themselves. Please keep the questions coming. Okay, so we have a healthy mix. Around 24 colleagues are saying they have heard of this minimum standard prior to this event, and others who haven't, which is fine. That's why we're here. So let's move to the next question, colleagues, which is if you could help us understand a little bit more about which of the minimum standards you would like to have a more of a deep dive in 2022, because as I mentioned earlier, this session today is really an orientation of what is there in the GBV emergencies minimum standards. We won't be able to do much of a deeper dive into any of the standards per se. So do let us know if from the options that you have, the 16, which ones do you find the most compelling for you for next year? Okay, excellent. That's quite a range. I can see we have our work cut out for next year. If all the standards are being requested, that's great though. That's great to see. But I can see there's, okay, let's give us one more minute. Okay, well, there's quite an interest around this, which is really heartening. We can also see there are some very specific ones that there's a lot of interest in. So psychosocial support, GBV case management, and it's a bit hard to read, but referral systems, and of course we have women and girls participation and empowerment, of course, and safety and risk. So this is really valuable, colleagues. Thank you so much for indulging in this exercise and letting us know about the various interests that you have in different standards. And this is something that we'd love to talk to you about a bit more at the end of the orientation today about where to take this next. So let's begin with a very short video on the GBV emergencies minimum standards, and just to give you an overview of what we're going to discuss today. Can you play the video, please? Thank you.
You work with women and girls in emergencies and are committed to addressing gender-based violence. Often, you are the first to respond. But you also have questions on how to safely and effectively deliver services. How can I increase women's participation? What is a quality safe space? When is a referral complete? What skills should GBV staff have? How can I better assess GBV risk? Did you know that there is a resource where you can find the answers to all these questions and more? The Interagency Minimum Standards offer clear and practical steps any organization can use to help address gender-based violence in emergencies using a survivor-centered approach. Multi-sectoral response to GBV is life-saving. With the 16 minimum standards, we know what to do to improve the health, safety and well-being of women and girls in emergencies. Visit the website to find out more and please like and share this video.
Thank you. So now that we've had a brief overview of what we're going to discuss today, I'd like to invite my colleague Ridsdal from UNHCR Regional Bureau for Asia and the Pacific to moderate our first session on the introduction to the minimum standards. Over to you, Janice.
Great, thank you, Sujata. Excellent pronunciation. So yes, I will keep it short and sweet. I have the pleasure to introduce Imbal Sansani, who is a GBV consultant and actually the original drafter of the minimum standards, and who's currently working with UNHCR at a global level to help us with our rollout of the minimum standards. So she's very kind enough to join us all the way from San Francisco to give us an introduction and overview of the minimum standards, just to make sure that, I mean, a lot of you said were already a bit familiar with the standards, but for those of us who haven't yet seen it, this introduction will get everyone on the same page and help us to understand the purpose, the structure of the standards as a whole, as well as of the individual standards. So over to you, Imbal.
Thank you so much, Janice, and thank you everyone and welcome. I'm really excited to be here with all of you and see so many familiar faces. My first job in a refugee setting and in the humanitarian context was actually in your region in Mae Hong Son, Thailand, with some amazing colleagues that are here together today. So that feels very lucky. And Janice was one of the core group of people that gathered to create the minimum standards. So just really quick history is that really the minimum standards were conceived of in 2018, and a multi-agency, it was an effort that was led by UNHCR, UNFPA, the GBV, AOR, with UNICEF and IRC. And it brought together, it was an interagency community and task team to come up with what would look like, what a minimum quality of services would look like. So I'm glad to hear, like Janice said, that so many of you are familiar with the standards. So I'll go over these introductory slides quickly and then leave time for questions. So one thing to really emphasize, like I said, this was an interagency effort. The goal of the minimum standards is to clarify what a minimum GBV response is, so that we have so that we have minimum program quality, and also to enhance the accountability. And the other thing to highlight here is that the minimum standards are targeted toward GBV specialized actors. So these are people who have received GBV specific training or have experience or working on GBV specifically. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you very, next slide, please. Actually, one before, but go back. Yeah, awesome. So this is just an overview of the various, of the 16 standards. And now we can go to the next slide. Great. So, you know, there are 16 minimum standards, and the way that we grouped them is that there are 3 foundational standards. Those are in orange. And then there are 8 program standards. And then there are 3, those are in green. And then there are 3, sorry, I'm just looking, here we go at my notes. And then there are 3 process standards. So there's no perfect way to group these, but our approach was that, so looking at the foundational standards, the guiding principles, staff care and support, and participation and empowerment of women and girls, is that each of these are critical individually, but they're also fundamental to the implementation of all of the minimum standards. So these 3 standards underpin all of the program elements and all of the actions. So for example, the GBV guiding principles of safety, confidentiality, respect, and non-discrimination, plus general humanitarian principles of do no harm, those have to be part of the other 13 standards. So the foundational standards have to be followed by anyone who's doing GBV programming. Then there are the then there are the 10 program standards, and these are about guidance to respond to, mitigate, and prevent GBV and emergencies. So these are what we determined are the core GBV programming elements. And then the pink represents, the pink standards represent processes, collecting and using data, monitoring, evaluating, and assessing, and then GBV coordination. Next slide, please. So the intention of the minimum standards is to reduce variations in quality, and as a major step to define what constitutes quality. So they're also guided by an inclusive framework, meaning that it's guided by the principle of intersectionality and intersecting discrimination and barriers to access that increase risk of GBV. So, for example, women and girls with disabilities, adolescent girls, older women, women and girls with diverse sexual orientations and gender identities. And it's also intended to foster ownership of the response, where we can really evaluate what's happening in any given settings. And also really highlighting participation and partnership. On the other hand, this isn't comprehensive guidance. So as you know, we have guidelines from 2019 on women and girls safe spaces. There's case management guidelines, also interagency from 2017. There's all the GBV, IMS, in guidance that we have. So this isn't comprehensive. Other important thing is that this isn't one size fits all, or like the one resource that you'll need, but what we hope it has is the intention was to have references to a lot of other resources to get additional information. So what's important to understand about the minimum standards as a tool is that it explains, it outlines the minimum, what the standard should be. So it more focuses on the what of GBV programming, but not necessarily the how. So it's not a GBV training. And this is going to be important when you look at the facilitator's guide and the contextualization tool. Next slide, please. So a minimum standard, so how we defined minimum is we said that it would be of adequate quality. And what does adequate mean? Really, the bottom line is that it's good practice and it doesn't do harm. So what's also important to note here is we're not saying it has to be the best. We're not saying it has to be perfect. It needs to do no harm, and it needs to have basic quality. What's also really important to be aware of here is that it doesn't mean that because there are certain cultural norms or because it's a very difficult setting that you can go below the standard. You still want to aim toward the standard. The other thing, and what's also important is that we know that not everyone can do everything. So the other thing that's important here is that if you are in a situation where you cannot do, for example, you can't do case management in a way that's confidential and keeps your clients, keeps women and girls safe, then you might not, then you shouldn't be implementing that program element if you can't do it adequately, meaning if you can't do it without causing harm. So as another example, if an organization does psychosocial support, it must be able to do it according to the standard. The other thing is that a GBV actor doesn't have to do all 16 standards, but it should take on you know, it could be that one agency is doing case management, another one is doing psychosocial support. But overall, in the area of response, a GBV response will be full or will be of adequate quality if it includes all 16 standards. But it doesn't mean all 16 have to be done by one agency. Next slide, please. So this is, you know, information that's available in the introduction. But really the main point here is that the framing of the minimum standards, so kind of like the scaffolding, the home that it's in, is that you know, we're looking at gender equality and women and girls empowerment and participation. Always asking women and girls, including women and girls. Survivor-centered, GBV guiding principles and approaches, partnerships with local organizations and specifically women-led organizations, and also inclusive, like I mentioned before, of groups of people who have greater barriers, who are at greater risk, and also have greater barriers to accessing services. And then it's inclusive of male survivors with special considerations for children. And that, you know, the other thing that I want to mention is that we're currently updating the template for standard operating procedures. And one of the important elements that will be new in this revision of the SOPs is how GBV and child protection will be working together. Next slide, please. All right, so let me actually just pause here for a moment. I know that I'm speaking quickly. I'd rather hear from you. So before we get into the structure of each standard, let me just take a breath and see if there are any questions or if anyone would like to jump in to clarify. All right, so let's look at the structure of each standard. So each standard is structured in a similar way, and because many of you are familiar with it, you'll know what I'm with this resource already. You'll be familiar with what I'm talking about, and we'll be able, we'll also look at an example. So the standard language or the standard statement will be what GBV actors need to achieve to prevent GBV and deliver services. So the standard statement for GBV guiding principles for safety and risk mitigation, they will be different. Then each section also has key actions. So what's important to know about the key actions is that it's like a menu. You don't need to do all of the key actions, and you may want to add actions that are relevant in your context. But the list of key actions give you an idea of how to get started, give you an idea of different things that you could do to fulfill the standard. It doesn't mean you should do all of them. So it's not telling you this is how you need to do it in every situation. And this is going to be very important when you look at the contextualization tool later, because one of the things that you'll do when you contextualize is that you're going to look at the key actions that still need to be done, that are appropriate, and you'll also adapt the key actions to your context. The indicators are a few suggested indicators that measure the achievement of the standard overall. So you're looking at whether the indicators relate to the standard language, the overall standard, not to individual key actions. And there's another resource coming out on the indicators that's more about monitoring and evaluation around the minimum standards. The next section is guidance notes. So there's a standard statement, there's a general description of the standard, then there's a list of key actions, then there are indicators, then there are guidance notes. And so the guidance notes are looking at information, additional information on priority issues, or looking at specific populations that might need additional support, or that we need to be more conscious of including in our programming and outreach. And then the last section of each standard is additional tools and resources. So again, like I was saying, the minimum standards focus on the what constitutes a minimum response, a response of adequate quality, meaning a response that reflects good practice and doesn't do harm. But it doesn't tell you the how. It doesn't tell you how to do. So the tools and resources reference that. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so this is a sample of the key actions from Standard 2, Women's and Girls Participation and Empowerment. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. It's not saying this is how you need to do it, but it's a starting point for contextualizing. The other thing I wanted to point out is you'll see on the left that we're showing how to use the standards in the preparedness phase, the response phase, the recovery phase. You'll see that most of them have check marks, because we know enough in our programming right now that if you're going to do something for response, you should also be thinking about it when you're in preparedness and also in recovery. So that gets a little bit redundant, and we went back and forth. Is it too much if all of them have checks? But in the end, we decided to keep it in. Let's go to the next slide, please. So then the last thing to kind of is that to show how the minimum standards are situated or relate to other key resources that I know all of you are already using. So for example, I feel like 2018, 2019, maybe 2020, like so many different resources, but so there's like the new coordination handbook. And so the focus of that is for GBV coordinators. Then there's the IAC guidelines that we're all super familiar with, that's targeting all humanitarian actors, and that focuses on mainstreaming and GBV risk mitigation. And so really the minimum standards are focused on GBV prevention and response programming and target GBV specialized actors. So one last slide, and I'm highlighting that last point again, is that, so we have the minimum standards on the left. And so that's the first main document. Then the second main document is in the center. That's the facilitator's guide. That came out in 2020. That part focuses on understanding and applying the minimum standards. So it's a whole resource that includes PowerPoints and exercises around, so you can train people on the minimum standards. Within the facilitation guide, it looks like it's 2 documents, but it's actually 1 document, that says, it's part B of the facilitator's guide. It's a contextualization tool that helps you to apply the minimum standards. So the first part of the facilitation guide is about how to understand the minimum standards. It's a lot of resources for you to do trainings on the minimum standards, and to reach a greater understanding and familiarity with the minimum standards in your context. And then the second part is applying the minimum standards, and it's a contextualization tool, and Pamela will be reviewing that later. So I don't know how I am on time. I am going to check the chat, and also take any questions.
So Imbal, you're doing great on time, but we do have definitely some time left for questions. There was one question about sharing the materials. So maybe everyone, if you want to put your questions for Imbal in the chat, I'll start by just addressing that first question on how we're going to share the materials. So everything from the webinar, the links to the recording, all of that will be shared with the GBV IE regional ad hoc group, and also with everyone who registered for the webinar. So if you've joined us without registering, maybe you just want to pop your email in the chat. And then yes, so if there are any questions for Imbal, write them down. Source of knowledge here. I often find that it takes a minute for people to kind of come up with their questions, to digest all of the great information that you just shared. So actually, Imbal, I had one question for you, maybe just to kick us off. You've obviously been involved from the very beginning with this process. You've worked on it so for a while now. You've worked on the contextualization. You've kind of had more time probably than a lot of us in the region to work with it as a tool. So do you have any kind of like key lesson learned or anything from the past year or so with the standards that you want to share with everyone?
It's a great question. I think one thing, and I really noticed this, and I'd like to share with the, I think that, in so much of our work, there is a push toward, like innovation or doing things, that something has to be new, or maybe it's our need for excitement, but that, that GBV programming, there's really basic and important things, and that the most important elements for quality programming are really, it's first of all, it's not that minimum if we do things right. And and that there really are like these core elements, because now that we're working on revising standard operating procedures, guidance, and template, you know, it's only been a couple of years, but can see that the minimum standards are really holding up in terms of what's central or critical to strong programming. And the other thing is that, you know, but I think most of us have always known this, is that doing quality GBV program requires quality staff, and that also requires taking care of staff.
Those are all really, really great reflections. So thanks for sharing those. Okay, colleagues, so one last opportunity for anyone who has a question for Imbal to put it in the chat. And Lee Ashley is echoing the points raised by Imbal as well. Although, Lee Ashley, I invite you also, if you have any question or reflections you want to share, feel free.
Hello. Sorry,
okay.
This is Nila. Yeah.
Hi, Nila. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah. Do you have some tools to assess the GBV quality?
So you mean tools for assessing the quality of GBV responses as compared to the standard? Is that what you mean?
Yeah.
Good question. Over to Imbal.
Yes, great question, Nilar. Thank you. So not a lot. So there's certain things, you know, so for example, for standard 8 about women and girls safe spaces. So let me back up. Each standard has a few indicators that help you assess and to know if the standard is being met. But it's not comprehensive. And so I don't know if anyone can speak to the M&E tool that's being developed now with GBViE around the minimum standards, because I'm not familiar with that. But that's something that there are more tools developed. But then there's, for example, so with case management, which is standard 6, there are different tools in the case management guidelines, for example, a client satisfaction survey. So it's one step removed from the minimum standards themselves. So it's tools to assess quality that are available in resources that are referenced in the minimum standards. I'm sorry, I couldn't figure out how to say that in a less confusing way. So I'm happy for any follow-up, and for if anyone would like to speak to the indicator resource.
Okay, I'll leave it, maybe facilitators, if you wanted to speak on the indicator resource, you can feel free to unmute yourselves. But in the meantime, there's just an additional point from Catherine in the chat, which I think might make a really useful question to help us transition to the next session as well. So Catherine, first of all, is echoing Imbal's points in terms of the need to focus on human resource capacity and staff welfare. And she's saying we need to help people understand the so what of various tools, because sometimes people get overwhelmed and it's not clear what to use. And I think that's a really great point when it comes to these minimum standards, because we do have the standards themselves and then a lot of tools that are associated with them. And Imbal, as you already said, you know, they're not a how-to, so there is a need to have other tools. But I guess maybe the question is, as practitioners, how do we use the standards and the associated tools without becoming overwhelmed, without feeling like it's so much that we can't deal with it?
Yeah, I love that. And so I think that, thank you for the question, Catherine, and safe travels. So the so what of the minimum standards is that, you know, is that we have some sort of reference for what we should be doing, and in order to not do harm, but it doesn't tell us how to do it, only some of it. So that's the so what. And I agree that it can be really overwhelming, which is why in each standard, we reference the main tools that, the main resources that will support in the implementation of the standard. The other thing is I see the question around the perspective of how the minimum standards link to the essential services package. So this is something that I've become more aware of, kind of like this comparison between the minimum standards and the essential services package. And you know, as I'm working with UNHCR and the AOR on revising the standard operating procedures template. So you know, I think the basic way is that the minimum standards are focused on GBV and emergencies. The ESP is more around like development settings, but of course, like we all work in a spectrum, you know, between like acute to recovery. So it's, you know, the binaries are helpful to organize us, but they're also very limiting. Also the other thing, and you know, the minimum standards are an interagency document, and from of course, I'm biased. I think this is objective, is a much more interagency and involved document at this point. I do know, and then I'll stop talking, that I believe UNFPA is working on kind of working out, you know, between like development and humanitarian, how those two relate. So it's a great question that has been coming up a lot, I think, especially in the last like 9 months, to my knowledge. Thank you.
Great, and thank you so much, Imbal. So I think we do have to wrap up this session here and move on to our next session. But I do also think that session is going to give us a lot of these answers in terms of how do we use the standards from a practical point of view? How do we link them? How do we adapt them to our context? And you know, that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the day. So I'm going to hand over to Lee Ashley, although I think first we are going to stop for a 5-minute break. Is that right, Lee Ashley?
That's right, Jenna. So everybody grab a glass of water, a cup of caffeine or other beverage of choice, have a stretch, and we'll see you back in probably closer to 2 than 5 minutes. To this very engaging discussion on the minimum standards. We'll just give everyone a moment to get settled, and we'll also return to our PowerPoint. And we have a really exciting lineup of speakers today. Just take a moment, get settled in the virtual room. Excellent. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Imbal and Janice. That was such an excellent overview of the standards and how they can support all GBV actors' work. So now we're going to move to the field so we can discuss how we are actually implementing these standards on the ground. This is the how that you were speaking of, Imbal. So we have a very esteemed group of panelists representing different agencies and contexts throughout our Asia Pacific region, and each of them is going to share an example of how they've used the minimum standards in their work and also tell us a story through visual images. So if we could go to the first slide, please. Great. So Janice, I would like to start with you. You've met Janice already, but just as a reminder, Janice Ridsdale is from UNHCR and she's working for the Regional Bureau for Asia Pacific based in Jakarta. And Janice, we'd really like to ask you to lead us today in the discussion by sharing your experiences with what I think many of us would consider the most foundational standard, which is Standard 1 on the guiding principles. So we'd like to ask you, what has been the biggest challenge that you've had in adapting this minimum standard, particularly for refugee context, and how have you overcome that challenge? Over to you, Janice.
Thanks, Ashley. Yeah, so absolutely. I'm going to start us off maybe with more of a kind of a regional example rather than a specific country, although I'll mention a few examples from some of the countries in the region as well. So I'm going to focus on kind of what we needed to do in terms of contextualizing the first standard 1 guiding principles for refugee context in Asia and the Pacific. And the pictures on the slide, so the first one on the left of the screen, this just shows 2 Afghan refugee women in Pakistan. But the reason I chose this picture is just to kind of highlight some of the populations that we have in Asia. So often when people think of Asia, they don't necessarily think of refugees, but we do actually have a lot of refugees in our region, especially from places like Afghanistan and Myanmar. So we do have a lot of refugee context. Unfortunately, most of our countries in the region are not signatories to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which means that we have a particularly challenging context for refugees in the Asia Pacific region, where they do not have access to asylum laws or refugee status determination procedures, usually outside of UNHCR's own procedures. And that means that they often live a very precarious existence without recognized documentation, without access to basic rights and services, and often at risk of detention and refoulement back to their countries of origin. And when it comes to women and girls, there's an additional kind of layer on this, where actually many women and girls face persecution on the basis of their gender, and that might be the thing they are actually fleeing from, or an important part of that. They might be fleeing from that. It also is something that we see as pervasive in asylum context and exacerbated by the limitations on their rights that I already mentioned. So in terms of a challenge, that's maybe our first challenge, is our quite particular context and limitations in a lot of countries in the Asia and Pacific region. So the second thing that I have on the slide is our UNHCR policy on prevention of risk mitigation and response to gender-based violence. And the reason I have that there is because the policy, which was released at the end of 2020, actually really takes the standards as a foundation. And the operational guidelines for the policy, which are coming out soon, do this even further. They have specific adaptations of each standard, which include and kind of try to integrate the specific issues faced by refugees, IDPs, and stateless people who are main people of concern. And actually, as I mentioned earlier, Imbal is working with us at the moment to help strengthen that rollout in UNHCR. So when we were looking at the Asia region, we kind of looked at our policy, looked at the fact the standards are central to this, looked at the specific issues that we were facing in our region, and we found the guiding principles standard, which is a really kind of foundational and cross-cutting standard, to be a really good kind of place to start in terms of rolling out the standards and our policy. So for those of you who don't know the standards by heart yet, I'm sure you will soon, but just as a reminder, Standard 1 specifies that all aspects of GBV programming are survivor-centered to preserve and promote the confidentiality, safety, non-discrimination, and respect for the choices, rights, and dignity of women and girls, including GBV survivors. So some of the key actions there include the training of staff, ensuring confidentiality and the consent of the survivor, and prioritizing their safety. So for us, basically, when we looked at this standard, we said, as a starting point, every aspect of our work that touches a GBV survivor should embody these principles. And working with refugees in this region, that meant not only looking at the kind of more classic areas of GBV programming, all of the things that Imbal covered already in the standard, but also looking at refugee status determination, documentation, and protection from refoulement and third country solutions. Because in this region, just because of the really particular context, those areas of work, which are not normally considered to be part of GBV response, are super intertwined with what we're doing in GBV case management, because it's only through those processes that you can also provide access to multi-sectoral services, and in some cases that you can ensure the safety of survivors. So in terms of our biggest challenge, I think the biggest challenge was really having to adapt our normal ways of working and shift those to be based on the standards. And I'll just, I realize I'm short of time, so I'll just maybe kind of give you a few kind of key examples of how we did that. In particular, I would point to Malaysia as an operation that has worked a lot on this, but also Thailand, Indonesia, India, Iran, and Pakistan are all working to incorporate this standard more in their different procedures. So specifically, we worked really hard to develop specific procedures and pathways within refugee status determination and resettlement for survivors of GBV. So as a concrete example, having separate interview protocols, for example, that specifically incorporate the survivor-centered approach. We've looked at having specific focal points who deal with survivors of GBV, including child survivors who all have additional training and expertise. And we've also looked at doing training and having specific procedures for LGBTIQ+ persons, including LGBTIQ+ women. And same thing in terms of the best interest procedures for children who are involved in these cases when they're child survivors. So I think just to say, I'll wrap it up there. There's a lot of work that's gone into this in terms of the contextualization of the standard. And I think this example for me and the way that the operations have really taken this on board just shows how it does require a dedicated institutional effort. And it also, I think, sometimes requires a re-examination of what you've been doing and a bit of a re-education of ourselves as GBV and protection staff. But it's definitely worth the effort, and I would encourage others also to look again at the GBV minimum standard 1 and how you can use it in your operations.
Thank you so much, Janice. I love the way that you've provided us with an example of how individual organizations can take the standards as a foundation to really assess and then guide your internal organizational policies, not just for GBV programming, but across a broader range of activities. That's super helpful. And I also love the message that standard 1, the guiding principles, is a good place to start. There's 16 that might feel overwhelming, but always standard 1 is a good place to start. Thank you so much. So if we could go to the next slide, please. And I'd like to introduce you all to Megan Denise Smith, who has been leading the IOM team's GBV interventions in Cox's Bazar and Bangladesh in response to the Rohingya refugee crisis. Megan, can you please share with us the primary challenges that your organization has faced in implementing Standard 9 on safety and risk mitigation, and how you've overcome those challenges in this unique and critical setting in our region? Over to you, Megan.
Thanks so much, Ashley. Just checking you hear me okay, because I am speaking to you from Cox's Bazar with dubious internet.
Yes, loud and clear.
Great. Hello, everyone. My name is Megan, and as Ashley already mentioned, I manage IOM's GBV programming in Cox's Bazar. And I chose these particular photos to be featured together because when we talk about Standard 9, safety and risk mitigation, it's really a process involving many different actors working together. And that is because we face a multitude of challenges in this setting because the Rohingya refugee response is so complex, multi-layered, and it's a constantly evolving protection environment with new risks that emerge. And these risks really can vary between and across different camps, particularly against the backdrop of COVID-19, where we've seen a lot of pre-existing GBV risks become further exacerbated here. So Rohingya women and girls face a number of mobility restrictions due to gendered social norms. So access to information and services is extremely challenging. Usually women and girls need to be accompanied by a male guardian. Their participation in camp life and decision-making is very limited in mixed group settings or alongside men. So there's a lot to consider to essentially ensure that you're not causing further harm, which is why I say it's a constant process, because given the challenges in this context, we need to ensure that we're identifying context-specific risks and vulnerable groups specific to that camp or site, whether that's through participatory assessments and data collection or safety audits. We need to be involving women and girls in assessing their own access to and safety around provision of services. So that really means listening to them and putting them in the driver's seat of their own safety. And ensuring women and girls' active participation in all the assessment and planning processes. And again, having girls telling you what their perceptions of safety are. And from all this information, we can better identify and implement these context-specific measures with the community to enhance their safety. So these photos really encompass this whole process. Here you can see some of our consultations with our teams in the Women and Girls Safe Space being carried out by one of our GBV staff. So that helps us get a snapshot of the risks to that specific camp and community. And from here, we can channel that information to other key sectors like CCCM, WASH, Shelter NFI, and so on. So through these consultations, what we can ensure is that one, we're putting women and girls in the driver's seat of their own safety in terms of how they want to participate or provide information involved in the various decisions at camp level, whether this be infrastructure upgrades like the location of lighting, or working with the WASH sector where latrines are built, or here in this photo you can see Shelter NFI sector, how a distribution line is organized, and you can see the photo here of the woman and child standing in line. And there is a preference here for sex segregated lines and areas separate for women and girls. And later, for example, we identified other things that helped ensure access and mitigate risks like breastfeeding corners or small alterations like this. And us being specialized service providers, we're really here to support and facilitate these discussions and channel the opinions and concerns and feedback from women and girls to other sectors. And what we really want to stress, I think, from this context is you don't go and do this once and ask, what do the women think about this, and you're done. GBV risks are always evolving against a complex backdrop of protection risks and new shocks and stresses, whether it's COVID-19 or monsoon-related risks or cyclones. All of GBV-related risks intersect with all of this. And so it's a constant process of soliciting feedback from women and girls and really ensuring that we are adapting our programming in real time and in line with their perceptions of risk, safety, and their own ideas for risk mitigation measures. And this is really best done with the collaboration of specialized service providers like GBV specialists working in partnership with more non-protection sectors at ground level, guiding this process. And that's how we best can overcome many of the many challenges that we face in implementing the standards in our context. And with that, I'll hand over to Lee Ashley for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. You raised so many important points. First of all, I like that, minimum standards you can take as high level as regional level, country level, but you've shown how really their implementation is most valuable at the site, camp, very local level. And then also this message that it's not a one-off. Implementing the minimum standards is a daily process. So your time is invested well today, everyone, because this is something that we will be doing 365 days a year moving forward. Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate those examples. So now let's move to two different contexts. Thailand and Pakistan. And I'm excited to see in the chat, there's some old friends from Thailand here with us today. So we're quite delighted to have with us GBViE and Mavish BB from the International Rescue Committee. And they are going to share their experiences implementing Standard 8 on women's and girls' safe spaces. So Mavish, can I ask you to please start us off? Describe what have been your biggest challenges as well as successes in implementing this minimum standard. Over to you, Mavish.
Thank you, Lee, and hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this session, and it's going very informative for all of us to learn about all the standards. So regarding the women's and girls' safe spaces, it has been a very good experience and interesting experience for us to implement this standard in Pakistan as well as in Thailand. I was like, from previous discussion, I was just thinking that all of these standards are somehow at some point interlinked. Like in the last slide, when we were talking about the safety assessment and safety audits thing, we are doing the same thing in the safe spaces as well. So all of these, the standards are interlinked at some point. In the safe spaces, we are providing the safe space provides a place where women and girls can enjoy their can learn something, can have their own space, so that it's structured place where their physical and emotional safety is respected, and where women and girls are supported through different stages of empowerment by raising awareness, by providing different services. Basically, there are 5 objectives for this safe spaces, and 5 kind of services, different services which we are providing. These safe spaces provide a entry point for the GBV case management. If a GBV survivor visits the safe space, and we share with her that there are psychologists on the safe spaces which provide psychosocial counseling to the survivors. In addition to that, the staff at safe spaces conduct different group activities, including awareness sessions and on GBV, women rights, empowerment, and child marriage. There are like multiple issues, and women and girls identify the issues themselves, and they set the agenda of the sessions. So the important things at the safe spaces, the women and girls, they are leading that place. We lead the activities, we conduct the activities as per their choice. Even they have developed the awareness messages to be disseminated in the community. Similarly, they are getting vocational trainings over there. We have created these safe spaces at a place where which is accessible for everyone, every woman and girl at that space. And they learn the vocational skills. Their families are happy that they are learning something. The biggest challenge which we have faced till now was like the selection of the place for a safe space, because there are like we have to take care of a lot of concerns when we are selecting the place in a patriarchal society. It's hard for women and at a place where women and girls are not allowed to even go out of their home. So there are a lot of concerns for selecting the places. For like the discussions, we did group discussions before opening spaces in the community, so that to increase the acceptability level. So these kind of challenges we have been facing, but it has been a very successful experience till now, because many women and girls are joining. You can see in the photos that we conduct psychosocial activities. They are playing sports, different recreational activities. They are leading activities. They have been training through Girl Child Group and all these things. I'll invite Mubi. She can share further about the experience in Thailand. The time is very short, and I don't know what things to share about.
Thanks so much. It's very
No,
good
thank you
opportunity.
very much. Over to you, Mubi.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was so great to see everyone, and also Imbal and Melissa. Back to the 15 years ago, I worked with them in Hong Kong. It's very great to meet them too. So I also really learned from them in the past many years. So now we met and then also learn about this together. I'm very appreciative for that. So just want to share with you about the WGSS, Women and Girls Safe Space. Actually, this is the IRC implemented directly in the refugee camp. We are also one of the country to implement WGSS in Thailand. So it's quite excited to have this opportunity as well. So by doing that, we also learn a lot. when we are mentioned about the vital entry point for female survivors, what I have seen, because many of the refugees, there might not be a safe house exists in the refugee camps. But in Mae Hong Son, we do assist the safe house is already there in place, say 2005 until now. So people know in the community, people really know where to go, where their experience come. So that when the women is come there, that they are more enjoying and working with other women, basically about the psychosocial support or knowledge or skills, but related to the violence, if they experience, they know where to go there already. So when we are tracking about the data, how many of them that we refer to the safe house is less than 1%. So I would say that for those countries who already exist the safe house, it might be not applicable under WGSS, because WGSS objective is one of the main entry point. This is, it will be applicable more where there is no existing the safe house. And another thing is, I also see the curricular for the girls. We have the girl child curriculum, but for the women, we have the speak out, but there is no the global standardized for the women curricular. Yeah, but for the girls, we do have the girl child curricular. So that is also applicable, that we could apply under the WGSS there, but it's a gap that we should the women's curricular standards. That is the thing that we miss. Related to the empowerment also, like there is also different content, different region might also approach different thing, but for us, we also try to develop some of the guidance for the women leadership course. So we are also applying under the WGSS as a part of empowerment. So we started pilot this year, and we will continue at least one groups in each year. So there is also, we might also come out with the women and girl, for the women leadership course in the future under the WGSS. So currently we have 3 safe house in Mae Hong Son contest. See, there is more than 500 people, girl and women come to registers to come to regular. They really enjoy, they really get the feedback. Community really supported with the WGSS. So I think this one is really essentially need for the communities. So there is no people against this program at all. I can see from the local CBO, camp-based organization, camp leadership, they really support to work with this project. So that is the experience that I learned so far. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mubi. That was really useful. And I'm really glad you pointed out there's often confusion between safe havens, safe shelter, women and girls safe spaces. And I hope everyone takes the opportunity to look at Standard 8, because it has definitions and really helps explain what are the distinctions between those different types of activities. So thank you so much, Mubi. That was very inspiring. And thank you, Maevish, also for pointing out how all of the standards are interlinked. That came across so clearly from your wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
So now, due to time, let's move and invite our next dear colleague from our regional GBV and Emergencies Working Group, Claire Hollowell, to tell us more about how the International Planned Parenthood Federation, or IPPF, are implementing Standard 4 on healthcare for survivors. Claire, in your role as Global GBV and Emergencies Advisor, can you please share how you've seen IPPF successfully adapting to the challenges that organizations face in implementing the standard, particularly in the Asia Pacific region? Over to you, Claire.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ashley, and thanks to everybody. While we're doing shout outs to GBV communities in the Asia Pacific region, I currently work for IPPF, but I used to work with the DRC program in Rakhine, in Myanmar, and I want to say hello to Myotanda and Momozan, who I see, and I miss you guys, and I've learned so much from you that is going to be, I think, in this presentation. So, hi, I'm Claire, and the visual image I chose is one of our teams in an emergency response being trained. I will say that I don't think this particular image is training on GBV, but I wanted to use it to say that that's really how we have been focusing on implementing standard 4 within IPPF, making sure that people have the knowledge, have the skills. And I'll also say what isn't there. So when we were first looking through photos, like, okay, a lot of the healthcare work is actually based on the lives model. It's about working directly with survivors and making sure they have the support. But all of the images we had of a healthcare provider with somebody showed the person's face. And because our comms team are really upskilling on what are the kind of use of data and images, we decided to abide by that. So we've just got this photo here. So at IPPF, to institute standard 4, we focus on the MISP. So that's, I think, action 2, making sure the minimum initial service package is available from the onset of an emergency. And some of you may know already, but for those that don't, objective 2 of the MISP is specifically on preventing and responding to sexual violence. So providing clinical response, ensuring that pathways and referral pathways and connections are in place and known about for survivors in their communities, and obviously the prevention work that's common to everybody. So this is a really useful framework. But I wanted to talk about one of the challenges we initially faced, which was that, so IPPF is a federation. We work with local member associations who are independent local organizations, some of whom are massive and some of whom are tiny, who may have only one clinician, maybe just part-time for the whole country. So what we found was that especially the smaller member associations we worked with were looking at objective 2 and going, oh, well, we can't do clinical management of rape in this response. So, okay, we don't do objective 2. We're not GBV actors. And what we've done in response to that is really talk about the role that everybody plays. So making sure that our member associations understand that objective 2 is not optional. It is our responsibility in every country and every response to ensure that survivors have access, which doesn't necessarily mean that we are providing every single one of the services, but that we have that referral pathway in place, that we have the connection, so it's a warm referral to make sure that survivors are aware of their choices and connected safely to those, and that, of course, raising awareness of services available and prevention is for everybody, as well as advocating for survivor rights. So if they're seeing there is no option for clinical management of rape in a timely fashion in their community, that's something they have the responsibility to advocate for coordination. So that's going really well, but of course there are many challenges, and one I wanted to talk to specifically relating to some of our Pacific organizations is that referrals and structures where we focus very much on saying, hey, this is what we can do in emergency, but it depends on what is available in a non-emergency in a development context. So many of our MAs tell us that actually they don't have a national referral pathway, they don't have national SOPs, they don't have the structures to be able to do what they're supposed to be doing. So there we kind of have to focus on, okay, what can individual organizations do for survivors without that framework in place that's still safe, that's still abiding by the principles, which is where these minimum standards are so important and so useful for us. But also how, as member associations, but also as IPPF globally, we can advocate for, work with national organizations and some of the other international organizations to try and get those frameworks, those referral pathways in place altogether. And I think that might be my 5 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you, Claire, and perfectly on time. Thank you so much. That was really useful and engaging. And I like how you pointed out, we can use the standards in a way to say you must, right? Yeah, you know, this is not optional. You have to look at how you can implement this, but also we can use the standards to say you must not. And that goes back to our foundational guiding principles, do no harm measures. So you've really illustrated how that comes to play under the implementation of the health standard. Thank you so very much. So unfortunately, due to time, we have to go on. I think we could have spent, you know, an hour on each of these standards. But now I'd really like to move to our next speaker and introduce you to Sonia Rastogi, who is a primary prevention specialist working in the Pacific region, based in Fiji for UN Women. Sonia, can you please describe the challenges and the achievements that UN Women has had implementing Standard 13 on transforming systems and social norms in the Pacific? Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you so much. And it's really lovely to see and hear from so many familiar faces and see your chat. So I'm really happy to be here. I think, you know, our challenge in terms of transforming systems and social norms, I'll just focus on the primary prevention component of the standard. It's really existential in the sense that the changing of social norms and changing hearts and minds takes a very long time. And it does take that step-by-step work to figure out how we do it and how we navigate in that space. And I think the way that we've tried to look at it in the Pacific and specifically in Fiji, I'll just give examples from Fiji in particular, is thinking about how we get upstream of the problem by looking at long-term social norm change that goes in an emergency and in non-emergency times, but that can really flex and bend during emergencies. I think also we're in a context that has cyclical natural disasters that are getting more severe and more frequent. Of course, COVID, and in some of the countries in the region, civil unrest. And so we really look at how the national system can be strong enough to be able to flex for the emergency times, because they are the same actors. So in the prevention space, just wanted to share two examples. The first, the two photos that you all see on the left, they're probably familiar if anyone has worked on SASA. So in Fiji, we are implementing SASA Faith with the House of Sarah, and it's looking at faith-based networks, doing that over a 4 to 5 year period. And in Kiribati, we're working on SASA Together, adapted for the Kiribati context. So many of the essential actions in the standard are embedded within the SASA framework. And so while we are implementing we are staying in the integrity of SASA, the same community activists and village leaders and village activists also embedded within the women's movements and women's rights organizations are the same people who, when there is a cyclone or when there is COVID, they do switch over into an emergency response role. So they have the key messages. They're really grounded in looking at power and looking at gender equality. They know the community structures and networks, and we really work on supporting them and working with them to be able to think about how they might shift and adapt things differently in an emergency. So that's been really, really a great adaptation process for us, especially during COVID, and thinking about how we do that emergency response work remotely, or on the phone or on Viber or on WhatsApp. I think the other piece to share, one of the key actions in the standard is looking at social and behavior change communication strategies to enhance the effectiveness and sustainability of service delivery and build that acceptance. And so in Fiji in particular, for natural disasters and for COVID, we've worked the photos on the bottom in the purple with the helpline numbers. That was looking at how we increase the awareness and understanding of available services during COVID-19, looking at a completely phone-based, remote-based model, and really embedded in a prevention approach, which is the photo on top. Fiji is going through a national action plan to prevent violence against women and girls. So it is more of that systems setting for national policies. But because there are so many stakeholders that were engaged across this whole of government, whole of community approach for the National Action Plan, including those that work in the GBV space, but many who don't, such as education, such as youth, such as sports, we were able to really use that platform during COVID to have all these different avenues to get out messages around accessing services, but also shifting norms around, especially caretaking work within the home, and looking at more equal power sharing and decision sharing, looking at how you caretake for children, looking at also many people have lost their jobs due to COVID or had their income shrink in their household. So we were able to embed these messages across a wide range of actors and to get it out through these really sort of niche communication networks, because everybody has sort of their space and their platform. So those are some of the ways that we're looking to hopefully build on this more. It's definitely challenging, of course. And I think, you know, the other piece that is challenging for us as well is how to really anticipate and what preparedness looks like in a chronic natural disaster context where cyclones and flooding and storms are getting more severe and more frequent each year, and they're happening earlier, or you know, more storms are happening more frequently. So that's a challenge for us in terms of also supporting the prevention staff who are also deeply affected by what's happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. That was really useful. Also, how we've been able to highlight in this webinar, you know, we have conflict affected contexts, we have refugee contexts, we have natural disasters, both sudden onset and protracted, as well as cyclical. And then we have the pandemic on top of everything else. So I really like how you've shown how in one context you're dealing with all of that. And it's constantly shifting. So thank you very much. I also like how you've shown how you can integrate this social norms work into other entry points. So you tied the referral standard to this transforming systems and social norms. So thank you so much for that presentation. And that makes me very sad to say that this is the end of our panel presentations. I can see that there are quite a few questions in the chat. So I'd like to ask our panelists if you can write responses to our participants in the chat for those directed specifically to you. And we do have 2 minutes to take perhaps one question. Aha. Okay, and if we still have Imbal on the call, I also might throw this one to you or Sujata. Phil was asking, I'm curious whether there is a technical note or something that links or coordinates the PSEA minimum operating standard, ISC PSEA strategy, and the GBViE minimum standards. How does PSEA relate to the GBViE minimum standards? Imbal, do you want to take this one?
No, because I'm not familiar with the PSEA minimum operating standard.
Okay, how about you, Sujata? Any thoughts on this one? Or Alex?
Yeah, maybe Alex, you can also come in from IOM. But I think from our side, I mean, this is really a great question. I think what we are hoping is at the global level, we see quite a bit of work now going on in terms of making sure that the strategies that are coming out for PSEA are abiding by or linking with the resources that are coming out on GBV. So, you know, there was a recent closed door conversations around this in terms of how do you make sure the referrals are building in the support to SEA survivors, etc. But I think in terms of the specific guidance, I think at this moment, I'm not aware of any, except that there is a e-training or online training that is coming out very soon. Can't tell the time because I myself don't know, but in terms of GBV case management, where there is a built-in PSA standard as well, or component as well. So, but this is a space to watch out for, because I think that's where there's been a lot of demand. So thank you for raising this very important question. And we take it back as something that we would like to also look for if there are any, and then also to maybe if it's a gap, this is somewhere where as GBV and Emergencies ad hoc group, we may need to work closely with the PSA working group to take it forward. Thank you. Back to you, Ashley.
Thank you, Sujata, and thank you for that question and all the others. I apologize for time. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we will see how we can respond in chat box or in the follow-up with resources and responses to you after the webinar. But the fun's not over. I now need to hand over to my colleague, Pamela, to take us through an interactive exercise where you can discuss more with all our panelists in the breakout rooms. Over to you, Pamela.
Thank you, Lee Ashley. So hello, everyone. I'm Pamela Marie Godoy. Same with Lee Ashley. I'm also covering Asia and the Pacific for the gender-based violence area of responsibility. Thank you so much for the rich discussion and the excellent questions that you're posing in the chat box. Can we go to the next slide, please? So as Imbal highlighted earlier, this is, you have your minimum standards, plus you have two companion documents, essentially. You have your facilitation guide and you have your contextualization tool. So in terms of the facilitation guide, this was released earlier this year, about February, and it aims to equip a diverse range of implementing, supporting, and planning actors around GBV programming and doing GBV specialized programming in emergency context with two crucial aspects. The first one is to ensure that everyone would have a solid understanding of what the GBV in emergencies minimum standard is. And secondly, it's a process for assessing how the GBV in emergencies minimum standards are currently being implemented in your respective context to support the enhanced application of the standards while ensuring do no harm principles. So part one has the facilitator's guide per standard together with slides, presentations, and 3 to 5 participatory exercises for a total of 64 interactive exercises that address common programming issues and challenges. The accompanying presentation slides or decks provide an introduction to each minimum standard, plus core concepts, questions for discussions, as well as the key actions. The current exercises may be adapted for virtual training modalities. For instance, we have done the survivor's journey several times virtually. So it's a great adaptation. We either use a Jamboard or we use a cork board. So we can expound on that later on. Jeffrey, if you can post in the chat box that particular link, GBVAOR link, because you can find all of the resources in that particular web page within the GBVAOR website. And you can also download all the presentation decks from that particular web page link. For the next slide, so just again going to the second part of the facilitation guide, which has the contextualization tool. So the contextualization tool outlines a process for applying, localizing, adopting the GBV in emergency minimum standard for the realities to how things are working in your particular context. So the contextualization process itself may be seen as an intervention because it supports reflection, planning, and collaboration among members of the GBV coordination mechanism and other relevant stakeholders, especially if, let's say, in contexts where government actors play a key role, especially in leadership with the GBV coordination mechanism. It is also an important process toward building a stronger community of practitioners and policymakers who are committed to delivering accountable and quality GBV prevention and response services. To go through the 4-step process, I would like to call on Imbal because she has led this process at the global level. Imbal?
Thank you, Pamela. So the contextualization piece, as Pamela just explained, is extremely important because this is how we take, this is how we make the minimum standards real in a specific context. So you'll see in the document itself that there is this 4-part process, and it's set up like 4 columns. So first of all, to start, you're only going to contextualize or look at the standards that are currently being implemented. And so your main question for each standard that you'll be looking at is, you know, is the standard currently being met, and how is it currently being met? So in the first phase, you're assessing to what extent is the minimum standard currently being implemented. And then in the next step, you're looking at the key actions, the table of key actions. And again, you're looking in your context, identifying the key actions that are necessary to achieve the minimum standard in your context. So it could be that you are doing many of the things, many of the key actions already, but maybe there are 1 or 2 that you can add that will take you to the level of the standard. Then the next piece, so you've assessed the extent to which the minimum standard is currently being implemented. Then you're going to look at the key actions. Are there ones that you could be doing that you could add? Are there ones that you could improve how you are already doing them? And then you're going to look at who do you need to coordinate with. So we know that coordination is a big part of our work, and also that none of our agencies can do all of the 16 standards that are required for a comprehensive response. So you're thinking about who are the main actors in your area of implementation that you could work together with to achieve that specific minimum standards. Then you're also looking at any tools or resources that can help you with implementing. And so it's true, and we talked about this a lot when we were developing the contextualization tool, is that so often our first thought is, you know, that we need money, we need more resources, we need more staff, and this is 100% true. And we also want to think, in addition to that, you know, we also want to think, are there, you know, people who can conduct trainings? Are there any resources that could be shared? And then the last step, so you've identified anyone that you can coordinate with, and you've also looked at any tools or resources that you need. And then the last step is really to plan who will do what by when. So it's just an encouragement to take the assessment step, the identification step, the identification and coordination of actors, and then to make a plan of who will do what in order to improve the quality of that specific standard. So those are the 4 steps for contextualization. I'll pause here if Pamela, you want to add or to leave time for questions.
Yes, we still have our breakout sessions, and I see the excellent point from Doreen. Yes, and the GBV and Child Protection Cooperation Framework will be launched, I believe, tomorrow. So that particular cooperation framework will be helpful in that process of connecting GBViE minimum standards with the particular child protection minimum standard around caring for child and adolescent survivors of gender-based violence. So excellent point, Doreen. So now we will going to move on to our next exercise, which is a breakout group. And each group will be assigned 2 minimum standards, but in the interest of time, you will only have 15 minutes in your breakout room. You may want to prioritize a particular standard. There will be a facilitator per room to help you with the documentation of your discussion points. We will be using a Jamboard. So we will have 3 questions that will be posed during the breakout grouping. We will be asking about key actions necessary to achieve the standard, tools and resources that can accelerate the implementation, and most importantly, what technical support will be needed from the regional level. And just as a note, we would also like to gauge your interest, and you can discuss this further in the breakout room. We are thinking of creating and designing a facilitated virtual learning or training platform. So we want to elicit your level of interest, and if that would be something that would be helpful for the field colleagues, please give us additional information in terms of the length, the frequency of having live sessions vis-a-vis self-paced learning sessions, and the time commitment that will be feasible from the field. So at this point, can we have Jeffrey and OD to do the breakout rooms for us?
Hello, welcome everyone. I'll just share the Jamboard with participants. So you can access the Jamboard via that link, which is in the chat now. Let me know if you have any issues or challenges with the link. So we're working with 2 standards, standards 11 and 12. I'll leave it to you to decide if there's any preferences that you guys would like to work on, either standard 11 or standard 12. Can you guys hear me? How about now? Just testing my audio. Sorry about that. Can you guys hear me?
Hello, yes, we can hear you.
Hi, Teresa. Okay, so we're working with 2 different standards, digital dignity kits, cash, and voucher assistance, which is standard 11, and standard 12, economic empowerment and livelihoods. I'll just post the link one more time. So that's the link. And shall we decide on working on standard 11 or 12? Do you guys have a preference? If not, I'll just pick one for us to discuss. Okay. Oh, looks like we are just one person now.
Only me.
That's okay. We can give it a try. Shall we give it a try? Would you like to work with the dignity kits, cash, and voucher assistance, standard 11, or standard 12, economic empowerment and livelihoods?
I don't know, a new person is joining, so what is her? Well, I think we can go first with the dignity kids, and then
Okay.
yeah.
So we don't worry about typing. I can also type down stuff. So for the dignity kit, cash, and voucher assistance, so women and girls receive dignity kits and or cash and voucher assistance to reduce GBV risk and promote safety and dignity. So the first question is, what key actions are necessary to achieve the standard? What do you think, Teresa or Saiful? Welcome, by the way. So in order to implement the dignity kits, cash, and voucher assistance, what key actions are necessary to achieve the standard? Any thoughts? If you're speaking, you're on mute, so I can't hear.
Sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah, I'm checking their standards.
So in order to achieve that standard, what do we need to do together? So there's probably some considerations for getting the kits to the right people, right? Does this require a type of identification or assessment?
Yeah, I think we need to make an assessment on who need the dignity kits, and also the the safety and security one while distributing the dignity kit, because in our context in my country, in some areas currently there is a limitation of distribution of the kits to the IDP population because of the military checkpoints and so on. So there is a risk for also those who are distributing the kits, and also delivery of the distribution of kit is also challenging in our context. Yeah.
Okay, so safety regarding the distribution, sorry, my spelling's really bad. Distribution of kits. Okay. What other key actions are necessary in order to achieve the standard 11 dignity kits, cash, and voucher assistance? Welcome, Amin.
Thank you.
Okay, so far there's definitely identification that's important, making sure that the right benefactors are getting the kits. There is a consideration for the safety of its distribution. So maybe we can add or expand on that one. So there's a need for security in order to ensure kits are delivered safely. How about regarding collaboration and partnerships with local communities? Is there a consideration there that we need to have? Maybe something to do with information sharing? What do you guys think?
Yes, I think so. Because in our area, sometimes like I think it is also linked to the safety and security that I mentioned. So we cannot go to the IDP, that areas, but the local and local organizations, they can access to those areas because they know the context very well, and they know the best way to distribute the kits. So we usually coordinate with them to distribute the kits. Yeah.
Okay, just writing that one down. Excellent. Amin or Saiful, do you guys have an opinion on the Dignity Kit cash and voucher assistance? We're in the first question, what actions are necessary to achieve this particular standard? So far we have 4 points.
Yes, I think it's a prepared module for the prepared module for our organization or our program.
So I'm sorry, could you repeat that one?
Yeah, prepared module for gender-based violence. Yeah, for our program. Yeah. Okay. And if we delivered our field level stuff. Yeah.
Okay, I'll write that one down. How about moving on to the next question? What tools and resources can accelerate the implementation? So how do we ensure a timely way to implement Standard 11 Dignity Kits, Cash, and Voucher Assistance? What do you guys think? What tools and resources can help accelerate the implementation?
Actually, for accelerate the implementation in this program, it's a need to training for field staff about gender-based violence.
Okay, that's an excellent one. So upskilling staff. Upskilling both organizational staff and people on the ground.
Yeah.
Great. How about partnerships? Do we need to ensure that our network is well informed? What do you guys think? And what other tools or resources do you think we need? Teresa, what do you think? In order to accelerate the implementation of Dignity Kits, Cash, and Voucher Assistance. You're still muted, by the way. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I think I think the training is included. Also, we need to. I think we need to stick to the GBV guiding principles because sometimes we are distributing the kits, but sometimes not respecting the confidential, respecting the safety and confidentiality of the survivors. Sometimes even increase the risk of the woman who receive the kits or cash voucher assistance. So we need to make sure the safety and do no harm.
Excellent.
Principles.
Okay, looks like we have about 30 seconds. Maybe we can move to the last question very quickly. What technical support is needed from the regional level? What do you guys think?
Actually, from regional level, support need to update information to give the program.
Okay.
Yeah, also it mentioned like safety audit as part of dignity kit distribution as part of the safety audit. So I think we can also get some information, orientation about this. Yeah.
Safety